Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 99 of That's a Good Question. What has That's a Good Question accomplished? Well, our podcast is nearing a milestone that's going to coincide with an important change that we'll be making to the podcast. We've been doing this now for over 2 years, and with some short breaks on holidays and on a few other occasions, we've been pretty consistent over 2 years. And so that brings us to today, which is our 99th episode.
99.
I know. It's hard to believe. It doesn't feel like it's been that many.
Yes.
But for those of you watching, it may feel like 200. We've decided that with next week's 100th episode, we were tossing around different ideas, live call-in show.
Yeah.
We don't have the technical chops to pull that off. We thought it's a good time to make an important change in all seriousness that we've been talking about for a while, and that is to change the frequency of our episode release schedule. So we'll go from a weekly release schedule to a monthly release schedule, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
And it's partly because we think the purpose for which we started the podcast has been accomplished, and we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to review a bit of what we've been able to accomplish. But next week will be our last weekly episode, and so for that, we're going to ask you, and I'll remind you at the end, but we're looking for some questions to go through, kind of rapid fire, more than we normally handle. We usually focus on one or two, and we'll go through as many of those as we can next week. So I'll tell you about how to get those to us at the end of this episode. And it may be, as time goes on, we'll return to a weekly schedule, or more than likely, we'll have a monthly release schedule, and then as needs arise, we'll interject an episode. So the goal will be the second Saturday of every month to release a new episode. All right, so in order to evaluate what we think we've been able to accomplish, it's going to require that we reminisce a little bit about what was going on when we began.
To reminisce about 2020?
Exactly. What was going on in 2020 when we began this, and what was it we were trying to address for which we thought a podcast would be a good method of communication. So why don't you start us off then, remind everyone what was going on back then and why we thought that's a good question would address it.
Well, thankfully, 2020 is somewhat in the rearview mirror, but we're still dealing with lingering effects from it, politically and even medically, with regard to the way people see the health administration of the federal government and how they performed or lack of performance during that time. It was just a difficult year for everybody. It was that combustible combination of politics in the presidential election that year and then the beginnings of a pandemic. And those two intermingled in really very unhelpful ways a lot of times. And so we saw that we needed to find vehicles of communication to counter some of what we saw as harmful, especially since during the pandemic, we weren't meeting regularly. And so that form of gathering every week needed some kind of a substitute, even if it was just going to be a temporary substitute.
Yeah, I recall the two of us talking the first week of March that year, and you said something like, this COVID thing may really be a big deal. I think we were both seeing news stories in our news feeds, and we're just kind of chatting. Our doors have or our offices have adjoining door, and we're just kind of standing at the door chatting. You think this is going to be big? And you said, I think this might be serious.
Right.
And basically the following week, the health officials made the announcement about it, urging that everyone take 15 days to flatten the curve. And I just triggered some people by saying that phrase. Some people on either side, some people, right?
For sure.
So with pretty much, they decided to close everything down. And it was kind of jarring to me. I remember walking through this building, in fact, and a place that was pretty much every day had people coming and going, and it was just nothing going on. And then on Sundays.
And then if you walked in in your neighborhood, if you drove your car during those first few weeks,
Yeah.
it was just desolate and,
Yeah.
just unprecedented.
I don't want to minimize either, but it was reminiscent for me having lived through 9/11 and no planes flying over.
Yeah.
It was so dramatic of a change,
Yes.
is what I'm saying.
Yeah. True.
So, and then that stretched into 3 weeks, and then, as we all know, into what seemed like ages.
Right. And with each pronouncement by the government, federal government, and the various states, and how the states were each handling it differently, and then you mix that with the politics, and so is it a red state, is it a blue state, and is this going to favor one candidate over the other in November? So now you've got this really toxic mix of politics and what should be focused on health, but politics came into it too much. And so with each of these pronouncements, both at the federal and various state levels, there was immediate reaction. Some of that reaction was very alarming and partly related to the politics of that year. I mean, we were only days into it when I began to hear from folks that the pandemic was being overblown and that it was really nothing more than the flu. You may remember that. And so, here I am having to now try to educate myself on this, not just for myself, but on behalf of our leadership team and our congregation. So I started looking up, well, how many deaths are there per year for the flu? And the number is still in my mind. That was 38,000 a year over the last dozen or so years. And in the first couple of months, we had 60,000 deaths due to COVID in March and April of 2020. So this was clearly more than the flu, but you had a lot of people who were hearing that. I soon learned that it's the flu, people, was the opinion of the now late Rush Limbaugh. And of course, he held great sway for many in the conservative political environment that is our ideological home, which also means then for many in our congregation. And, they say that was our ideological home, at least before the political party that used to represent it, took a very, very far right turn over the last few years. So I'm still personally conservative. You're still personally conservative, but there are a lot of people like us who are wondering when there's going to be a new
voted in the primary.
person.
I just voted in the primary and voted as a conservative.
Yes, same. My guy got 4% of the vote. But
sounds like we voted for the same guy.
But we're hoping for a new conservative party to arise at some point. But what that fusion, though, that mixture of politics and science, or depending on who you talk to in your perspective, pseudoscience, meant was that your view of how the pandemic should be treated was not only a statement about health, or in the church context, a statement about what you thought was the best way to model and to minister Christ in an unprecedented situation. Rather, instead of all that, it represented where you stood politically. Some looked at it wondering, are you going to be a dupe of the deep state? Are you going to allow the so-called experts to dictate what you do, setting the stage for their larger designs for control of our freedoms, including religious freedom? I mean, I had people sending to me right away, making sure that I knew as the pastor what's really going on here. And this is a setup for martial law.
I'm glad people do that because, we all know you're a slouch when it comes to keeping up with the news.
Yeah.
You hate anything to do with politics. Last
So
person who's going to be in the know is you.
Please
right.
inform me. In fact, how about this, though? Every time anyone feels the urge to inform me, send those to Pastor Larry Castle.
It would actually be more fitting for me because I could use a hand every now and then. So we're laughing here, and I don't want to make light. People are trying to be helpful, really. But we've had a lot to say intentionally about where you go to find that help.
That's right. And really, it is helpful. Certainly the persons who do that think it's being helpful.
Yeah.
It is a form of lobbying for your position because what you're trying to do is you're trying to influence decision makers, within, in this case, within the church. And so you're trying to make sure, there's nothing wrong about it, certainly nothing sinful about it. No. But for being on the receiving end of it, it's very daunting.
Well, and I want to add to that because someone recently said something to me related to this. And I know that in some cases, especially early on, it's folks who just really care, and they're taken in by some of these things, and it's concerning, and they just want to make sure that. So I'm not trying to make fun of a person who would do this, but some of these sources really, in time as we look back, they're really ridicule worthy.
And that's what we had to deal with, for sure. So, and I'm not exaggerating when I say immediately I began getting communications by text, by email, by phone, and seeing what some were saying on social media as well. And it was clear that the pandemic was going to be not just a problem in itself as a health issue, but it was going to be a hot button issue with political overtones and spiritual overtones too. How you reacted to it would demonstrate in the minds of some whether you had godly wisdom or not. And for some, the only way to demonstrate that godly wisdom was to see the government's nefarious designs and to stand up to those. And we saw that. We saw that across the country. We saw that in churches and in other places. And then if you don't, then it's because you don't have the guts to take a stand. Or worse, you might be part of the deep state yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I was part of those early discussions with you, and we included our full leadership team in agreeing on the direction that the church should take. We'd talked about make sure all of our perspectives were taken into account.
Right.
But you had to take the leadership role for this as our senior pastor, and so it could have been something that really took a personal toll on you. How did you fare personally through the last 2 years?
Well, I'm very, very, very thankful to say I've been just fine in God's grace, and it's only a matter of God's grace. And God's grace displayed in no small part because we have an excellent, as you mentioned, leadership team who understood that we needed to take the long view on this and not to simply react to the political provocations of a very volatile environment. And I'm going to say in a little bit later that I know of churches, I know of pastors personally who are not fine through all of this. And part of the reason is they were trying to placate everybody. And if you try to placate everybody in this ever-moving, fast environment, and you haven't agreed as leadership in the church, how are we going to do this? How are we going to handle this? Because we're all being inundated, and everybody's got their own views on these things. And if you fail to do that, you are just going to get bombarded, and you're going to try to make everybody happy. And guess who you make happy when you try to make everybody right? Yeah. So we all had our own views as a leadership team, and we all didn't agree on the severity of the pandemic or even always what should be done, but this is what the blessing of our leadership team is. We always agree on this. Whatever we do has to be for the best interests of our flock, has to be for the best interests of the congregation. And we cannot make good decisions if we're simply reacting to the passions of the moment. And the passions were really, really high. Right. Everybody had an opinion to share about what we should do in terms of cooperating with the government, defying the government, distancing, not distancing, masking, not masking. And many shared those opinions, like I said.
I was going to interject there. That is a good example, a good model. I think the way the leadership team interacted on these, when there's not 100% agreement on everything, that when you share a common goal, you can work through those differences.
Right. Totally. Yeah, amen. But, and this is the other reason that I'm fine. There's our leadership team, and thank the Lord for that. But namely, overall, overwhelmingly, our congregation. The audience for this podcast is a bit wider than our congregation, but it's started for and is primarily for the benefit of our congregation. And overall, overwhelmingly, our congregation performed admirably.
Yeah, absolutely.
In what could have been a very divisive situation. Not all, of course, performed, as well as others, but almost all. Yeah. The squeaky wheels always get the attention. But that's just, a handful of people who go on social media, and folks think that you perhaps have a big problem. But we did not, and thank the Lord, we do not. And I know I speak for you, and I know I speak for the entire leadership team when I say how thankful we are for the maturity of our congregation that showed up big time during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple conversations that I saw between folks that, became heated, but in the end, overwhelmingly,
Yes.
like you said, people disagreed agreeably, and the spirit of deference was very visible.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about what we asked the congregation to do and how their cooperation with us helped to keep unity and our leaders' sanity, as you pointed to,
Right.
and what role this podcast played in all that.
Well, because we were all getting advice from folks who were each hearing disparate voices telling them whether the virus was really serious, whether the measures the government was taking were helping or hurting, and even whether the government was using this to take away our freedoms. Like I said a bit ago, I had people saying they were certain that this was a prelude to martial law that was going to happen, especially in Michigan. Because remember, Michigan got the reputation as being a gulag.
Yeah, people who weren't here heard that it was way worse.
Oh yeah, on Fox News primarily, and Governor Whitmer really got quite a reputation, bad reputation among conservatives and evangelical Christians. I had friends from Arizona contacting me, checking to make sure I was okay. Are you guys all right? So. And let me just stop and say, thankfully we can kind of chuckle at that because the reality was quite different. It was hard on everybody.
Yeah, especially people whose businesses were shut down and impacted.
But in terms of church, in every one of, as we pointed out a number of times, in every one of the executive orders saying we're going to shut down for another 2 weeks or whatever it was, in every single one of them, houses of worship were exempted from being prosecuted or fined.
And that always was highlighted in my mind because that's what we're talking about here. When you say friends were worried about you, you mean how's it going at church?
Yes, right.
We're not trying to minimize the impact that shutdowns had on businesses, but comparing that's what stands out in my mind is so many people were adversely affected by this, and yet we were given, as much consideration, more consideration than any other sector.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's very true. So because of all of that, because you had all of those different ideas and people were getting all sorts of different information, we had to agree, we, the leadership team, had to agree on centralized information. Otherwise, it's going to be the Wild West and every man for himself. And then you're locked into what I'm convinced many of my friends in ministry found themselves caught in. They were getting, communications from everybody. They're trying to juggle all of that. And you simply are going to have to make a decision. This is where we're going to get the information. It's important to remind ourselves it doesn't mean that those people that we chose to get the information from were always right, that we agreed with those people all the time, that they communicated in a helpful way, but it meant it was centralized. We all understood where we were getting it, and so we didn't have to juggle it from all sorts of sources. Do you remember people were up in arms about, here in Michigan, liquor stores being open?
Yeah.
But churches being closed, which then came out to be, liquor stores are essential, and churches are not.
Poor word choice there. And
that's what they're doing.
Part,
that we were going to have essential businesses open, but these liquor stores also sold food, and food was essential. But that's the way it came out. And then there was the inability to buy garden seeds, and that created an uproar as well. So we had to ask the congregation to understand our need to get information from those who were authorized to provide it. Now, that meant government bureaucrats, as I've said, which meant bungling and confusion, sometimes just foolishness that we had to put up with, but we're putting up with that for this larger good. Unity, because we have this centralized information system. And our congregation, by and large, went along with that. And I think that was the most crucial and helpful decision that we made, and the most supportive and important decision the congregation made. Now, you contrast that and what happened with us.
And can I maybe bring out a nuance in what you're saying there?
Yeah.
We're not saying that we expected everybody in our congregation to just have this hive think and everybody thought the exact same thing about everything because we went to one source. We're saying when it came to making decisions about how will we operate, will we have events publicly? If we do, what kind of guidelines will we observe?
Yes.
That's where we
Exactly.
got centralized information for making those decisions that affected the group, our church as a whole.
You got it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly it. So contrast that with what happened with many other churches. I mean, we lost a few people, but we gained more. And I know of churches personally who closed.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a friend who I graduated high school with. Hadn't heard from him since we graduated. I didn't know what became of him. Turns out he went to Bible college. He became a pastor. He met a gal at Bible college who's from Colorado. He moved out to Colorado, became a pastor. His church closed during COVID, and it closed because of disagreement about how to handle things. I know of 4 pastors right now who are on sabbatical due to strain from 2020 and 2021. Now, I know more than 4 pastors who are on sabbatical. Not all of them are for that reason. Some are just, it came at a good time for them to have a rest after so many years. But I know of 4 personally who are on sabbatical, and it's because of that, because of the toll that it took. I don't need a sabbatical due to COVID. I don't need a sabbatical due to the election, and that's due in large part to our leadership team and our mature congregation, and I am very thankful for both.
Yeah, I add my thanks to that. Yeah, lots to be grateful for in that. So we had to address sources of information for the pandemic and also sources of information for the politics that were going on at the same time.
Right.
And that kind of had a Wild West feel to
Yeah,
it.
it did.
And that's partly where the podcast came in.
We,
right?
here we are now. We're not meeting every week. It's weird for everybody. Nobody likes it. What are we going to do? And then to add to it, that would be hard in normal circumstances, right? But then add to it, well, then what's everybody doing? Everybody is listening to stuff.
Yeah.
And then they're informing each other, and they're going on social media, and then they're informing us.
It's hard enough when you have 2 or 3 meetings a week where you talk to people to combat all that.
Yes.
Then you go down to 0 meetings a week.
And then it's all still, coming in. So we needed ways to communicate to the congregation. Now, we needed that whether there was a political firestorm or not. But add to it that you had all of this kind of mayhem, informational mayhem going on. And so we needed a forum all the more.
In fact, we have, on our Sunday morning, we have our worship service first, for those of you who are watching but don't attend our church. And then we have a Sunday school hour, the next hour, which for our adults we use for outreach. And so we had initially just kind of translated that to an temporarily online format.
Yeah.
And then we saw the need, for
right.
something like this and thought, well, there's the opportunity.
Yes.
That second hour can be used for that.
And there was misinformation and there was disinformation that we were all being inundated with politically.
Yeah, and you say misinformation and disinformation. I think those terms tend to get used interchangeably. Can you make sure everybody knows what the difference is?
So misinformation is false information. Disinformation is intentionally false information. They're both false.
Misinformation is they got their facts wrong.
They got it wrong.
Disinformation is they're plotting to mislead you.
You've got people misleading you. The airwaves were and are filled with both. And when I say that, some of you may be nodding out going, oh, yeah, the liberal, the mainstream media, they're disinforming on purpose all the time. And there's plenty of that goes on, to be sure. The mainstream media has gotten its bad reputation, well earned, for good reasons a lot of times. But I'm not talking primarily about that because I don't care that much about that because I know most of our people don't get most of their news from that. The disinformation I'm concerned about is more the stuff that we get. Remember years ago.
By the way, I think I get the convention, but I think it's odd that we've referred to mainstream media, and then there's the conservative media, which about half the country watches faithfully, almost religiously now. Seems like mainstream's just kind of a misnomer.
Yes, because it has shifted. Because
it made sense back when I was in college. I get where that comes from.
Well, and I've said on here for these last 2 years a number of times that we think this is the worst. We've got this conservative media telling us how much we need to fear everything, when in fact, so many things are aligned in our favor more than they ever have been in my lifetime. There's a lot of really bad stuff going on in the culture. Of course, I am not oblivious to any of that. But when you think about how much media you have available from a conservative standpoint, you didn't have any of that stuff. When I started college, you had none of that.
Yeah.
Nowhere.
It's a lot harder to kind of manipulate people, though, if you're just kind of inspirational, focusing on the good things that we're working on, and versus instilling fear. You can kind of move around and
fear
push
sells.
groups.
I'm going to remind us of that before we sign off today. So, this disinformation that I'm most concerned about is not the stuff we're not listening to. Why would I be concerned about that? It's the stuff we're listening to.
Right.
And that is, I remember years ago, we had a brother in the church who was very concerned. He was an African-American brother. And it was after, I think, Trayvon Martin was killed. And he sent a text to you, me, and maybe 7 or 8 other guys in the church. And he just said, pray for me. I'm really having a hard time with this. Well, I thought, wow, he's seeing this in ways and experiencing this in ways that we're not. And I wrote to him and I said, would it help you? You sent this to about a dozen of us. Would it help if we got together and just talked about it? And he said, I think so. And we did, if you remember.
Yeah.
And as he was talking about how he was seeing this, I was hearing some conspiratorial stuff going on there. And I said to him, hey, tell me, where do you get your information? And he thought for just a second. And he said, mostly from RT. RT, that's Russia Today. That's a cable show. And you got people doing that. And well, what is Russia trying to do?
I was going to say, I'm really a skeptical red flag pops up right away with just the name. I mean, don't judge a book by its cover.
You would think.
Yeah.
But what's Russia trying to do? Does Russia have good designs for us? I mean, to have some people talk, including in conservative circles now, which to my amazement, yeah, Russia's our friend. Putin's our friend. I don't understand how that quite happened. I mean, I understand partly what's going on. He is, believe it or not, Putin is considered an upholding Christendom. He's upholding because he's very anti-gay, and they have very anti-gay laws and so on. So this guy is kind of a hero for us, supposedly. So I don't think Russia has good designs for our country. I think it's to their advantage to sow discord. And that's what they do through RT. That's what they did in the 2016 election. That's a fact. It's just a fact that they interfered. You had 12 people who were indicted in Russia for what they did via Facebook primarily to try to seed stories that would sow discord and move toward one particular candidate and against the other. So that's disinformation. That's on purpose, okay? Yeah. Then you got a guy like Steve Bannon who says, look, we just throw stuff against the wall. We just flood the zone with, and then he uses an unsavory word, but just flood the zone with this stuff and put it out there. You got Alex Jones and InfoWars.
Knowing that what we hear frequently, what I've said is, there's so much information out there. How do you sort through it all?
Just put it out there. Throw it out there. Yeah. Exactly. And people just get so confused. I've heard that from many of our listeners. I just get so confused. I just kind of throw up my hands. Who are you to believe? This has helped some of those people. They have told me, and I'm thankful for that. But then you get guys like Alex Jones and InfoWars, who was in the news just this week on
some
trial. Good news that he's getting his comeuppance on some of his just heinous disinformation. Well, that's intentionally false information. And then you get misinformation. That's getting the facts wrong and drawing false conclusions. The so-called stolen election is an example of that.
Would you consider jumping to conclusions under misinformation? There's still culpability there in many cases because you shouldn't rush to judgment.
That's correct. I totally would. Absolutely. Yeah. And the so-called stolen election is an example of just getting it wrong. And we've tried to emphasize on this podcast a number of times the difference between evidence and proof. You know that literally everything is evidence of something. Every fact is evidence of something. What's it prove? You have to put it together. You have to prove that it amounts to something. And nobody's been able to do that to this day. So having a way to address the congregation and answering biblical and spiritual questions we thought might be of interest, and those that were submitted by our listeners, but also having episodes that counteract this misinformation and disinformation, including in the political realm, was something that we saw a need to do. Now, again, I have to commend our congregation, as many have told me, that they have rethought their sources of information based on our podcast and also the blog that we started. That took some real maturity. Because what we were saying about Fox News, for example, was counter to what almost everyone in our congregation thought.
Yeah, I'll confess, long ago was an avid viewer of Fox News. I haven't had cable television in a long time, so it's partly because of that, but partly just because I realized politics was very much a distraction in ministry. My priority in my youth was often to persuade people of my political viewpoints, and I would find that would really interfere with bigger questions that I should be asking people God brings into my sphere of influence. So wasn't as much into that as all of this came about, but and so I didn't have as strong of a understanding of the problems with a network like Fox and some of these others that have popped up. But man, this has really shined a light on things I wasn't as concerned about as I should have been with those channels. So
I just want to say something with that I do think in God's good providence, that's another thing that helped us was, just having this interest that you've talked about. I've had this interest in this stuff over the years, but it's just been, everybody's got their hobbies and that kind of thing. In terms of church, it didn't matter much until our congregation started getting inundated with this kind of things. But I think that background did help us because many of my friends, I think part of the reason they just didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to answer the objections because they didn't know the machinations of our government and and how things work, and knowing that helps you to not get as alarmed because you know how the pendulum swings. You've seen the broad sweep of how the parties interact and how they use each other and all of that, and so you don't get quite as alarmed, and you're able then to bring that to the fore. I think that helped.
Yeah. And you were talking about, people, some folks showing maturity. I mean, many folks showing maturity and how they took what you and I have said, what we tried to do with the podcast. But that doesn't mean that the podcast has achieved a unanimity of thought among
it's
everyone.
True. But I think that just further commends the congregation's maturity. That we're not unanimous in what we believe about what should have been done with the pandemic or all that happened with the election, but I'm convinced that we now have higher standards for our claims, the things we claim to be true. We have higher standards before we draw those conclusions than we did at the beginning. Fewer people, I'm convinced of this, fewer people today in our congregation just forward stuff.
Right.
I'm convinced that people may think some weird things happened in the election, which is fine, but now they say it that way. They say, you know what, there's just some stuff there that was really weird, rather than drawing conclusions without proof. That's perfectly fine to just say, man, what is up with that, and that's fine. But then they don't say, hey, the thing was stolen without being able to prove it. I strongly believe that our sources, that our focus on sources of information and how you evaluate those sources has put us in a better position than we were in 2020 today, and in a better position than many of our sister churches, unfortunately, who just tried to hang on, get through it, rather than just take it on and try to correct what was manifestly wrong.
Yeah. So problem solved. We put all that behind us, right? It's good to go.
Boy, don't I wish. Don't we wish? Yeah. But we need to remember, and here's why it's not. Because we need to remember that disinformation is a business model. And it's a tactic, a political tactic. So from the business side of it, the purveyors of information on cable, in social media, they make money off of doing this. I mean, the absurd amounts of money that Alex Jones made off of the lies. I mean, you talk about a guy lying, my goodness. He's made absurd amounts of money doing it.
In case you don't watch the headlines in court, this is just major, I don't know what you want to call it, but expose, undeniable. I mean, the video of him on the stand when it was revealed to him how he was caught in his lies is, you almost feel, I don't feel bad for the guy, but you almost do.
Yeah,
you almost do as just a human.
That's
he looks like he's going to swallow his tongue.
Yes. And they found that even though he was saying, look, I'm bankrupt, I can't pay any money to these people that I defamed, I don't have any money or very little money, they proved, documented, this guy would make up to $800,000 in a day selling merchandise, all this kind of stuff. This guy, okay, all right. So disinformation is a business model. It's also a political tactic. So as 2024 heats up, let me just predict. I don't have to go out on a limb here to say disinformation is going to heat up as well. You're going to be inundated. We are all going to be inundated again with attempts to scare us and so motivate us. Motivated by, honestly, hate for those who disagree. Fear, Christian friend. We're going to be motivated. This is the attempt to motivate us by fear of what man can do to you. And here's what Scripture says. Proverbs 29:25, fear of man will prove to be a snare. And boy, isn't that the truth? Hasn't it proven to be a snare? So we're going to need to keep a close eye going forward. And when we see something that needs to be responded to, then do that. That's what the Apostle Paul did. That's what his letters were. They were him responding to things that were happening in the churches that needed to be corrected.
Yeah. So how would you summarize then what this podcast has accomplished?
I truly believe that, again, focused on our congregation chooses better, thinks better, concludes better, communicates better. Chooses better, which is what discernment is. Discernment means to differentiate between, better and best, good and evil, to discern. I think we choose better. I think that we think better as well because we diversify our sources. We look to original sources. That was a theme that we've kind of pounded home. Don't just go to somebody's summary of what they claim. The Mueller report said, get the Mueller report and read if you're going to comment on it. I mean, look, if you say I don't have time for 500 pages of Mueller report, I'm good with that.
I have never had a conversation about the Mueller report with any of you because I have not read the Mueller report.
Yeah, but you've got it available, right? So, and we contemplate, we think before we react, I think more now. I think we conclude better because we don't draw hasty conclusions. We don't make claims that aren't supported by not just evidence, but by proof. And then we communicate better because we see the wisdom of silence. Oh, boy. Of just, you don't have to comment on everything.
I heard a proverb, a variation on an actual biblical proverb, but it must be an American proverb, probably Ben Franklin, when I was younger, and that is the only successful substitute for brains is silence. That was helpful to me in my youth and has served me well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's wisdom in just saying I don't have to comment on everything, okay? And we also see the wisdom of reflection so that we're not posting stuff and spouting stuff whenever it just enters our minds and just sounds right to us. We're thinking about the larger audience who's evaluating Christianity by evaluating Christians. So we're making sure that our communication is always, as Scripture says, in Colossians chapter 4, in an evangelistic context, let your communication always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone.
Yeah, we saw a great example of this in I think it was last week. And it's a different topic, so we won't go into depth. We could handle this maybe in another episode, but someone who deals with confronting some of the misinformation and false teachings about the King James Version of the Bible, Mark Ward.
Yes.
He is the epitome of this, gracious and loving to people who are not so to him.
Yes, agreed.
And I think he's always provided a good model of that for me.
Yeah.
And along the way with what you're saying, we were able to address dozens of biblical topics in addition to these political topics that we're talking about, answer spiritual questions that you, our viewers, listeners, have submitted to us. And we hope to do more of that next week in our 100th episode, our final weekly episode. And then we're going to switch to a monthly episode. So please send us in your questions. You can get those to us by emailing them to info@cbctrenton.com. While you're at it, make sure you're subscribed to this YouTube channel and click that notification bell so you can be sure to get notifications when we release new content. And that is going to be all the more important when we go to a monthly format where we may have interspersed episodes as things come up.
Right.
So make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell. And that's it for this episode. We'll see you next time. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.